Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Tom Murphy, and I am the rector of St. Thomas's Church, and I am so glad to welcome you to the third annual event in our Shoemaker Speaker Series. And before I introduce our guests, I'd like to say just a few words about the Reverend Dr. Samuel M. Shoemaker, in whose honor this series is dedicated. And what I like is to hear my voice just echoing back to me. It's very affirming. I sound good, though, right? I'd like to say a few words about the Reverend Dr. Samuel M. Shoemaker, in whose honor this series is dedicated. He was born in Baltimore in 1893 and baptized here at St. Thomas's. He grew up not far from here at the Shoemaker estate called Burnside. And he was ordained on June 11th, 1921, and celebrated his first service of Holy Communion also here at St. Thomas's. In the middle part of the 20th century, Shoemaker was probably the best-known Episcopal priest, the author of some 24 novels, 24 books, the host of radio programs, and his sermons were mailed out to thousands of subscribers and even released on records. As rector of Calvary Church in Gramercy Park, New York City, Shoemaker ran the Calvary Mission, which hosted meetings for alcoholics. And in 1934, Bill W., the future co-founder of AA, attended some of those meetings. And later, both Bill W. and Dr. Bob were influenced by Shoemaker's teachings, especially the beautiful notion that the best way to hold on to something, for Shoemaker, it was faith. For Bill, it was sobriety. The best way to hold on to something was to give it away to others. Shoemaker was a primary spiritual influence on the development of the 12 steps, especially the ideas of self-examination, acknowledgement of character defects, restitution for harm done, and helping others to achieve and maintain sobriety. Bill W. wrote, and I quote, "Sam Shoemaker is quite as much a founder of AA as any of us could be." Shoemaker died in 1963, and he's buried in our churchyard beside his beloved wife, Helen. And the goals of our speaker series are to both honor Shoemaker and also to bring his work into our time and place. And I am so grateful that both of our guests are going to help us do just that. Dr. Jamie Marich describes herself as a facilitator of transformative experiences, a clinical trauma specialist, expressive artist, writer, yoga teacher, performer, short filmmaker, Reiki master, TEDx speaker, and recovery advocate. She unites all these elements in her mission to inspire healing in others. She began her career as a humanitarian aid worker in Bosnia-Herzegovina from 2000 to 2003, primarily teaching English and music while freelancing with other projects. Jamie travels internationally teaching on topics related to trauma, EMDR therapy, expressive arts, mindfulness, and yoga, while maintaining a private practice and online education operations from her home base in Northeast Ohio. Jamie is the author of numerous books on trauma recovery and healing, and many of those books are available for purchase here today and has more projects in the works. So how about a round of applause for Dr. Jamie Marich? Hold on one second. And I'm also glad that my friend and colleague, the Reverend Ariane Rice, is here. She is an Episcopal priest currently serving as rector of the Church of the Good Shepherd in Ruxton, Towson. She is also the creator and host of Feeling Beings Who Think, a podcast that explores how transformative experiences shape our vocation and callings. She has a passion for partnering with people dedicated to personal and professional growth. Ariane is a leadership coach with executive-level clients in healthcare, faith-based communities, and nonprofit leadership. She came to leadership coaching as an outgrowth of her work as a certified Daring Way facilitator, of the methodology of Dr. Brene Brown, teaching and designing retreats, workshops, and classes in a variety of organizations. And by the way, Ariane and I studied together at the General Theological Seminary in New York, which is where Sam Shoemaker, about 80 years before, also studied. So we'll begin today with a presentation by Dr. Marich, followed by a short break. And after our break, Ariane will interview Dr. Marich, asking her own questions and also your own questions. So there are index cards on your seat, and if you come up with questions, you can write those down, and during the break, you can give them to me, and then I will share them with Ariane. So please welcome Dr. Jamie Marich.
Thank you so much, Father Tom. Well, the traditional way to introduce oneself in AA is, hi, I'm Jamie, and I'm an alcoholic. And I feel that's always important to emphasize, especially after someone shares my professional biography like that, because I have all those things because 22 years ago, I got sober. And I was very blessed, fortunate to get sober very young. I was 23 years old. I think it's just making me emotional because Tom showed me around the grounds today, and there's just so much history here. You know, so much of our sacred history, so much of the history, I guess, of mistakes you would call it, that we can learn from, and our past, and that's so much of what recovery is, right? Is taking a good hard look, honoring history, honoring ancestors, looking at where they were imperfect, and how can we be inspired by that imperfection to grow along our path. And yes, I am from Northeast Ohio. I actually live right now very close to Akron, Ohio, which is the traditionally recognized birthplace of Alcoholics Anonymous. So I live amongst so much of history of the recovery movement there too. And I'm very grateful because I don't believe I would have lived to 25 if I didn't get sober at 23 at the age where I was, because a lot of the reason I initially started drinking was as a response to trauma and unaddressed mental illness, mental health. And even as I say these words, friends, I'm a big believer in pick a word that works for you. Because a lot of people are like, Jamie, why do you still introduce yourself as my name is Jamie and I'm an alcoholic? It helps me remember where I came from. A lot of us now have taken to saying, and sometimes I'll say, I'm Jamie, I'm a person in long-term recovery, because it is a little bit more positive or affirming language to show that recovery is so much of my identity. Whatever's going to work for you, that will help empower you to live in the solution and realize that you are worthy and deserving of recovery or healing. And even that word recovery, you might be asking, well, what does that mean? Yes, it's something we traditionally use if we are on a path of restoration and healing from drugs or alcohol. But as a lot of us have learned to say in this movement, everybody's in recovery from something. You could be in recovery from growing up in a toxic family, in an abusive environment, in a toxic faith or institutional setting. You can be in recovery from what it means for you to be an American in this day and age and in past ages. And there's a lot of things we can be in recovery from. And if you would prefer to use it as, or think of it as a word more like restoration or healing, redemption, pick a phrase that's going to work for you. And the real focus of this talk today is to talk about trauma and the role that trauma can play in the development of addiction and other mental health struggles, but also how naming trauma, claiming trauma, and taking an active path to address it can be a lot of what informs our recovery, our healing, our redemption, our restoration. So I actually found alcohol, well, I guess I should say, because I know a lot of you here know Alcoholics Anonymous or know the 12-step movement and 12-step recovery. Some of you don't. And one of the phrases I like the most that I learned in the 12-step movement is experience, strength, and hope. That yes, I am technically a professional with a bunch of credentials now, and I've written a lot of books, but at the end of the day, I'm somebody who has a story of recovery to share from where I've been until now. And I know that the topic is to educate you more about trauma and hopefully to help you see what trauma might be, maybe what it's not. But I do like to do that through the lens of my lived experience, because I was blessed beyond belief to be introduced to the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous by a woman named Janet Leff from Cleveland, Ohio, who was also very close to the founders, some of the initial founding people of Alcoholics Anonymous. But Janet really knew and understood trauma. And she knew when she saw me, she was dealing with a very wounded child who, at 21 years old, was trying to figure out how to live as an adult. And was not expecting this, but I've learned to just go with it. This is my way of honoring my ancestors and those who brought me healing. Because Janet recognized me as that wounded child that needed care, that's why I was open to receiving a lot of what the steps that Dr. Shoemaker was so influential in influencing Bill and Bob to create. That's why I was open to the message of those steps, because they were shared with me by somebody who really cared about me and my story and wasn't just trying to get me sober. There's another real great phrase that I learned in the rooms of 12-step recovery: attraction rather than promotion. And it's this idea of, don't preach to a person, show them with your life, show them with your example, with your kindness, and that will hopefully open a door to some conversation. So part of how I got here, I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, in a home that I'll just use the general term was dysfunctional. You can interpret that to mean what you'll interpret that to mean. There was abuse, a lot of it of the subtle variety, meaning that things looked great on the outside. All of my basic needs and most of my wants were taken care of. We were often told things like, "You're such a great family," but inside things were very hectic and chaotic, especially due to my father taking part in a pretty extreme religious group that tortured us in a lot of ways, especially did not look too kindly on people who were different than them, did not look too kindly on gay people, queer people, and even as a little kid, knowing that I was different, at least from the eyes of mainstream society, and I felt like I had these feminist leanings and I was attracted to all genders. It's like, I don't really feel safe with my family. I was also bullied pretty significantly at school. I grew up as a chubby, weird kid at a Catholic school, and today I wear weird as a badge of honor, but back in the day, I felt like I was born in the wrong time, and I didn't quite fit in with the kids I was supposed to go to school with. So there was a period of time, a good chunk of years, around middle school where I didn't feel safe at home, I didn't feel safe at school. And so eventually, as I got to high school, things got better. I was starting to connect with some peers that were more like me. Self-injury was a part of that early middle school period where I just didn't want to be here because no place felt safe, no place felt affirming or welcoming. And so I would say, if I'm looking at the sum total of my story, mental illness was actually there first. And even as I say mental illness, I don't even like calling it mental illness anymore. It's a response to what I was going through. And a lot of those responses included, even at a very young age, thinking I don't want to be here anymore, starting to hurt myself, and I mostly did that by hitting my head. And I had a lot of the tendencies to become an alcoholic from very early on. I also did something as a kid called dissociate. And if you're not familiar with the term dissociate, it means to sever or to separate. If you're daydreaming, that is technically a dissociative experience. If something uncomfortable is coming over you and you feel that you mentally want to check out, that became a big part of our identity as a kid. It's what we needed to do to learn how to cope. And then when drugs and alcohol were introduced to us, it's like, ooh, drugs and alcohol helped us dissociate a hell of a lot faster. And we were able to just be here but not here. Now, I actually did not start ingesting chemicals until my later teens. I had other addictions I dealt with before that. Food, self-injury, as I already mentioned. But part of my father's brand of religion was that you are going to hell if you pick up a drink. So guess what was appealing to me, right? When I left their house, it's like, let me pick up all the drinks and all the drugs. And so I spent most of my undergraduate career really learning how to numb myself in various ways. I was never a daily drinker, but I was very much a binge drinker, binge pill user who did it so I wouldn't have to feel feelings so hard. And the reason I make that qualification is a lot of people compare themselves out of saying, well, I'm not an alcoholic, I don't drink every day. I'm not an alcoholic, I'm not an addict, I've never been arrested, I've never been this. I was close to a straight A student through most of my drinking. It's what I hid behind. And then eventually towards the end of my drinking, I did drop out of my first graduate program. I started experiencing some academic consequences. But an alcoholic, an addict, a person with mental health struggles does not just look like one thing. And even in the rooms of recovery, the reason I say I graduated valedictorian of my high school class is not to brag on myself. It's to say that it happens to all of us. Because we all are beings who feel. We all are beings who are capable of being wounded. And when we grow up in a house or a church or a culture or a society that doesn't support us feeling our feelings, of course we're going to stuff them down using whatever is available to us. And for me, that was a lot of dissociation as a kid and mental health struggles, and then drinking eventually became it. So I knew I was in a very bad way shortly after I turned 21. I had a couple more serious attempts on my life. I knew that at a certain point, I'm like, well, everybody my age drinks. Even I knew it was going too far, because even after a night of binging, people would look at me like, what did you just do? And my path was very much, when I had consumed chemicals, I just wished I wouldn't wake up in the morning, in addition to some active suicidal, self-injurious behavior. So in order to address it, I did what most people do, and I moved to Europe. Because, yeah, I did try bringing it up with my parents. And for my very religious father, the answer was, just go back to church. You're a backslidden sinner. You just need to go back to church. He thought the whole idea of addiction as a disease was hogwash. For his theology, it was very much a sin manifestation. And my mother's response was very much, you're too smart for all of this. You'll figure it out. Just, why do you have to, do those drugs? Can't you just drink? So I took that advice quite literally. Yeah, and I did do some initial help at my campus counseling center when I was an undergrad, and that was a Band-Aid. It was a needed Band-Aid, for sure. It at least showed me that there was some kind of thing called help out there. But I did what a lot of people did and pursued what is sometimes called a geographic cure. Now, geographic cures are not necessarily a fix if you move, in my case, 8,000 miles away to Bosnia to do humanitarian aid work. In Bosnia and Croatia is where my family's from ancestrally. So it wasn't totally an out of the blue move. I had spent some time in the country studying the language, and I think for me now, looking back, there was a part of me that needed to go back to the roots of my family's trauma and get sober there. But what was pretty extraordinary about this geographical move of mine was that I met this woman, Janet Leff, who became my first AA sponsor. And remember, she was from Cleveland, Ohio. I'm from Youngstown, Ohio, about an hour away. And we met in a post-war zone in Bosnia. And of course, having that Ohio connection was, oh, you're from Ohio, I'm from Ohio. And it was very much that attraction rather than promotion thing. I just got to know her as a really nice woman who was very caring. And I guess I'll just caution you going forward. I use God language. I very much believe in the God of my understanding. Even though I suffered a lot of religious trauma, God and I have always been cool. It's what other people have done to God and Jesus that has caused a lot of the strain. So I guess part of my story is that what the 12 steps ended up showing me and the AA program ended up showing me is that God is a loving God, as opposed to the God I met in a lot of the church contexts I grew up in. So the total God thing for me, right, is how here I am halfway around the world, and Janet, who spoke no Croatian or Bosnian language, she worked through interpreters. I spoke enough, not enough to be a professional interpreter, but I was good in a pinch. And she took me to a meeting to translate for her because none of her interpreters were available that day. It was not specifically an AA meeting, it was more of a like county council on addiction meeting, and she was sharing a little of her experience from AA. And I translated for her, and after the meeting, we were driving back to the place we stayed, and I said, Janet, I think my mom's an alcoholic. Or I think this is a problem in my family. And yeah, a lot of us come into recognizing our own addiction issues that way, because tends to be a family thing. And if it's not that you inherit the alcoholic or addicted tendencies from your family, we often will chemical ourselves in response to family wounding, right? So, ever the patient woman, Janet answered my questions from where I was at. She did not try to, again, preach to me. She gave me a big book, an AA text, as some of you know, in the Croatian language. And she said, here, this might help you learn some of the words in Croatian. She knew what she was doing. And then about a month later, and at that point, I had stopped using any pills for about 7 or 8 months, but I was still drinking very heavily. And I couldn't understand why, after 8 months of what I thought was being clean and going to church, that I picked up drugs again. And she helped me to see that. She kind of did a variation on that famous song, if you're not with the drug you love, you'll love the drug you're with. And in that case, for me, it was alcohol. And I also, like many people in recovery, have struggled with unhealthy, toxic romantic relationships. Found myself in one of those that summer. And I still remember the first day that I talked with her underneath a tree on the grounds of this church that hosted, some of the work that we did over there. I still remember the purple dress I was wearing. It's a very visceral memory. And we spent about 2 or 3 hours that day just talking, kind of like Bill and Bob just talked on the day that the first AA meeting is credited to have happened. And after I shared with her a little bit of my life and my chemical profile, her response was, Jamie, the good news is I think you're an alcoholic. And I said, how is that good news? Like, you're going to have to help me understand this one. And she said, it's good news because we know what to do about it. And at that point is when a lot of that religious training of, but it's a sin, it's not a disease, kind of came rushing up, and she helped me to see, like a lot of the early AA pioneers really forwarded. And whether you like the word disease or not in this day and age, it's this idea that it doesn't mean we're weak, that we're sinners. We have something that we can address, whether you want to look at it as a mental problem, a medical problem, a combination of all of them, that there is a solution. And for her, she offered me that solution, which at that point was the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and to start coming to meetings. And another turning point, though, that summer, because it took me about a year to get sober from the time of that first discussion until July 8th, 2002, which is when I took my last sip of anything. Here's where I want to talk about trauma. Because as much as I think the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous are amazing, yes, they have some 1930s language that need to be updated for some of us, like character defects, And that's a lot of what my professional work is about, is how can we update some of the language and some of the approaches. As much as I think the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous are amazing, I mentioned that Janet understood she was working with a wounded kid. And the most obvious manifestation of my woundedness was the alcohol and the drug struggles. But about 3 months into having really met her and started to do some meetings here and there and talking to her as a sponsor, something happened. I was actually working for a parish, and they were sponsoring 2 of the aid programs and one of the kind of pilgrim outreach programs that I worked in. This was in the Catholic context. And, a very kind priest was my boss, and one day at work, he asked me to do a task. It was nothing illicit, it was nothing shady, it was just something I had a real strong visceral reaction to doing on the day that he asked me to do it. And I melted down. I had a full-on panic attack, I started crying, I started lashing out at him in a way that was uncharacteristic. And he didn't know what to do, so he called Janet, this woman who became my sponsor, and he's like, she's acting like a little girl. I don't know what to do. Can you come and get her? And so she did, and I remember hearing her say to him, "Father, this isn't a little girl being spoiled, this is a trauma response." And that was the first time I ever heard anybody use the word trauma as it related to me. At that point, my understanding of trauma, if I had heard it at all, was the PTSD diagnosis, or post-traumatic stress disorder, and that was something that Vietnam veterans primarily experienced. I didn't even equate it yet to all veterans or all civilians of war. Any press I heard at that point, it was just a Vietnam thing. And to credit Vietnam veterans, the advocacy after Vietnam is what really helped my professional field be able to label trauma as trauma, and really the cause of a lot of mental health problems, right? So I remember she took me to the place I was renting that day after my meltdown, and she literally put me to bed and put a cold compress on my head as a way to get me to what we as professionals now say more of a regulated state, where I was able to talk with her about what had happened. And that's when we started discussing trauma. She was trying to help me understand if my outburst was triggered by anything, and my trauma history. And I said, "Janet, I never went through trauma. I never went to war." And here we were in Bosnia, which was just 5 years past a war. I was working with a lot of children who were survivors of that war. And she said something so profound that changed the course of my life. She said, "Jamie, maybe the war zone was your house." And here we were in Bosnia, which was just 5 years past a war. I was working with a lot. And when she explained it that way, it's like, yeah, that registers. And she said something. And I still had a lot of guilt because I was provided for. I had food. And we grew up very middle class. It wasn't like I was struggling like these kids are struggling. And she said, "I'm grateful that you have that sense of perspective, because gratitude for what you do have will keep you sober. But don't negate the validity of your wounds, because anybody can be traumatized by their family." And she said, "I'm grateful that you have that sense of perspective." And then in those months after, as I struggled still a little bit with recovery, the piece of advice she gave me that, again, further changed the course of my life was, "Jamie, after everything you went through as a kid, it's no wonder you became an alcoholic. And then in those months after, what now? What are you going to do about it now?" And in that directive was both validation for my experience and a call to action. She always used to say, if you know the AA Big Book, chapter 6 is called Into Action, not Into Thinking. And so she never let me just kind of sit in the soup of my misery, because that's not what taking a trauma-focused view of health or healing is. Because I've worked with a lot of people who can get stuck in, but my trauma, my trauma, my trauma. And then can get stuck around taking simple actions to address the day-to-day ways that that trauma may show up in your life. And so she really did challenge me into action. And eventually I did get it. I did get sober, and then when I moved back to the United States, I started doing some more in-depth trauma counseling to really further my sobriety. Because after I had been sober for about 2 years, the mental health symptoms were still there. They were very much still there, and that's where I needed some advanced help. All right, friends, so I've talked about trauma. I'm not the type to be bound to a podium, so I'm already impressed I stayed at the podium this long. And our friend here said I could wander a little bit. He's just going to adjust the microphone. So what is trauma? Now, you may have seen the title of this talk today and decided to come because you know trauma has been a part of your life, part of your struggle. Some of you may be saying, it seems like everybody nowadays is saying they have trauma. And what is it really? Is it something that's been a factor for me and has been a factor for my family? So let's break it down, because in my personal story, which I shared, having my life experience validated as trauma and the behaviors I engaged in as responses to trauma really made so much difference. And then when I started studying this more professionally, naturally I became interested in learning as much about trauma as I could, because it was such a key for my healing that I wanted to be able to share that with others. So I am still very much an English teacher. That was the main job I had when I worked in Europe. That was the first profession I had before I became a clinician. And I am still fascinated as an English teacher by things like word origin. Where do we even get the English word trauma? Where do we get the English word addiction, dissociation? So the subject at hand today, trauma. The English word trauma simply comes from the Greek word meaning wound. We'll put on the shelf for a minute things like post-traumatic stress disorder and dissociative disorders and the clinical labels that people can get. But I'm just talking at a very humanistic level here. When we talk about trauma, we're talking about human wounding. And when I'm asked for my working definition of trauma, it's any unhealed human wound. But I'm just talking at a very humanistic. In Western psychological terms, it may get you a diagnosis, but let's not start there. Let's start talking just human to human. It's any human wound. That wound can be physical, emotional, sexual, spiritual, a combination of all of them. So let's chat for a minute. I'm just going to call out a question. You can just call out an answer, and I'll repeat it on the microphone so our folks online can hear. What do we know about physical wounds and how they heal? A combination of all of them. Yeah, they leave scars. They can leave scars. To which the follow-up question I have is, do scars hurt? And I'll repeat it on the microphone so our folks online can hear. I always get a yes, no, maybe. Yep, you're exactly right. You're all right. There are variables at play, right? Scars can go on to be complicated or can hurt if things like an infection set in at the time of the wound, if a person's immunocompromised, if the cut or the nature of the injury wasn't clean. There's a lot of variables that are at play, but a key factor is if that wound doesn't get the treatment it needs, it can go on to create complications, even in the scarring. And scars can be a reminder. For some people, the reminder is a sign of empowerment. For other people, the reminder of a scar is a sign of shame. Since I talk so much about Bosnia, fun fact, I have a scar on my stomach. That is my I survived a Bosnian hospital scar, because I had a surgery when I was over there. And I look at that scar, which is still there 20 years later, and it's a good story. It's pride for me. But if that same scar was on my face, I don't know if I would feel the same way. That people can ascribe different meaning to their scars. Let's keep calling it out. What else do we know about wounds and how they heal? They take time. For many wounds, they can take a very short time to cause and a very long time to heal. Right? What else? Different meaning to their scars. Bingo. Wounds need to heal from the inside out. Yes, they often need to be treated from the outside in. Cleaning them out, stitching them perhaps, putting the proper bandages on or whatnot. But true healing happens from the inside out. And that is a problem I see in some modern recovery circles, is a lot of recovery methods can be very outside in. Going to meetings, talking about your problems, are technically outside in. They're important. You need the outside in. I'm not saying it's not important. But until you start feeling and getting into your body and really sharing very deeply, and for some of us, we may need what Bill Wilson, the co-founder of AA, called outside help to do that. Like, I'm here today because of 12-step recovery and because I had two amazing therapists and a group of other kind of pastoral friends and helpers along the way. My brother, who is a Catholic priest, used to say, it takes a village to spiritually direct my sister. And I'm like, damn right it does. And it's a badge of honor for me today, right? So what else do we know about wounds and how they heal? Anything that we maybe didn't hear discussed? My brother, who is a Catholic priest, used to say it takes a village to spiritually direct my
yes.
sister.
You're one of the few people who's ever gone there when I've called this out. You know, sometimes they don't.
Today, right? So what else do we know about wounds and how they heal? Anything that we maybe didn't hear discussed?
And I hear clients say that to me a lot. When am I ever going to get over this?
You're one of the few people who's ever gone there.
So a story I like to share when I bring up this issue, but you brought it up, so I'm really glad you did. I have a friend who was born with one leg. She was born with one leg because of her father's Agent Orange exposure in Vietnam.
So a story I like to
Healing for her
when I bring up this issue, but you brought
will
it
not
up,
mean
so
getting
I'm
that
glad
leg
you did.
back.
I have a friend.
Healing for her will never mean it goes back to normal.
She was born
Whatever
with one
normal
leg
is,
because
right?
of her father's Agent Orange exposure.
But what she has been able to do is adapt
Healing for her.
using prosthetic technology that's accessible to her,
Healing for
spiritual
her
support
will never
network,
mean it goes
artistic
back to
coping
normal.
skills, her own therapeutic support. She does advocacy with other children of Vietnam vets.
Been able to do
And through adapting, she has been able to live a full, functional, thriving life, even though the core wound itself,
spiritual support
won't go
network,
back to how it
artistic
should
coping
be, so to
skills, her own
speak.
therapeutic
And that she's had to
support,
do a lot
she
of
does
grief around
advocacy
that, as
with other
any of us
children
will
of
have to
Vietnam
do
vets.
grief work around that
Through
wound that feels like it
adapting,
just
she has
won't
been
heal.
able to live a full, functional, thriving life, even
And when
though
I
the core
just
wound
mentioned what I
itself
mentioned about my friend, to bear in mind that she has had access to those resources. And I think of so many people in our country who don't, or they have to be shown how to use those healing resources.
I just mentioned what I mentioned about my friend, to bear in mind that she has had access to those resources.
So
And I think of so
wounds
many people
need care,
in our country who don't.
regardless of whether the wound is small,
They
like a
have to be
cut,
shown how.
or large,
use
like
those healing
losing a limb.
resources.
And we can get into a lot, we do this on social media, right? Of like, well, what is trauma really?
Need care.
And real traumas are things like going to war or surviving a major accident. A real trauma is you having post-traumatic stress disorder. And to be clear, I do not want to impugn people who've experienced those things, because those are significant, major traumas. And if a person gets the healing and care that they need,
Or surviving a major
they may go
accident.
on, like
Real
Heather, to
trauma
live a
is you
healing
having
and thriving
post-traumatic
life.
stress disorder.
I think I've been
And
able to
be
do that
clear,
when I
do
look
not
back at
want
my
to
story.
impugn people who've experienced those things.
But you
Because
take
those are
something like, a bug bite that
major
infects.
traumas. And
That's not
if a person gets
real.
the healing
Suck it
and
up.
care that
Deal
they
with it. Friends, I ended up in the hospital this summer with an infected bug bite.
I think I've been able to do that.
I went septic.
Back at my story. But you take
So
something
even
like
these
a
wounds that
bug bite
appear small on the surface,
That's not.
and I'm talking now metaphorically, right? If they don't get the care that they need, they can go on to fester and infect.
I went septic.
Because so many people will come to me saying, like, I really had it good overall, even though
On the surface.
my father was constantly calling me names and
And I'm
putting me
talking about
down, and
metaphorically, right?
et cetera, et cetera.
If
That's
they
still
don't
a
get the
wound.
care that they need, they can go on to fester
It
and
still
infect.
deserves to be treated. And in the case of physical wounding, yes, some wounds take you to the hospital.
Even though my father was constantly calling,
Other wounds will just need some
et cetera, et cetera.
Neosporin. I actually thought mercurochrome in my head. I haven't heard that around in a while. That was like grandma's kitchen cabinet, right?
In the case of physical wounding, yes,
Some wounds need the Neosporin and the Band-Aid, and just give it some time, give it some space. That is still treatment.
Neosporin. I actually thought
That's what a lot of us need when we're grieving.
around in a while.
Because grief is a wound, just like trauma is a wound.
Right?
And if we're given the time and space for it to
Wounds need
heal,
Neosporin and
then hopefully it doesn't go on complicating our lives and showing up in behaviors that are problematic to
what
us
a lot of us need
and others around us.
because grief
So if anything I'm talking about resonates for you today, if it's provoking a question, please go ahead and write it down, because I always feel like I'm already getting to this. I've talked too long. I'm excited to actually dialogue now with you, with Reverend Ariane,
and others are
about what of this is landing with
Anything
you.
I'm talking about resonates
Because
for
some of you
today,
may
if
already
it's
be in
provoking
trauma
a
therapy,
question, please go
and this
ahead
is
and
making a lot of sense.
I always
For others of you, this may be the first time you've really thought about, does trauma apply to my story or my family story? And can doing some kind of healing work, whether that be 12 steps or professional work with a therapist or a healer or even a spiritual director, can that be useful and beneficial? First time you've really thought about, does trauma apply to my story or my family story? I want to end my part of the talk some kind of healing work, whether that be 12 steps or professional work, with something that with a therapist or admittedly may be a little tender if you're not in a good place with God right now. But I've loved about the 12 steps this language of higher power. You can even adapt it further to inner power. So if the language of a Christian God or a Jewish God doesn't work for you, be open to possibilities. My sponsor is an 81-year-old man who grew up Quaker. He's a Buddhist meditator, yoga teacher, incredibly spiritual in the obvious senses. And his husband is an 81-year-old veteran who is a card-carrying atheist. And I asked him once, Mike, how do you stand going around these AA meetings with people talking about God all the time? And he said, it's the collective of the group that does it for me. Just like knowing that goodness exists in a room of people who all want the best for me, that works as my higher power. So, to honor Reverend Shoemaker, who Bill and Bob really credited as being foundational in how they ended up wording the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, he specifically had influence on the first three. And we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. You can replace anything where they say alcohol. There have been like 300 spin-off fellowships now. Al-Anon, Narcotics Anonymous, Debtors Anonymous. There's even some groups specifically using kind of the impact of trauma and mental illness as the thing we're powerless over. That our lives have become manageable. And one of the criticisms of the word powerless that exists in the modern era is, but it feels demeaning to call myself a powerless person. That's not what the step says. The step says I have no control over criticisms of the word powerless, the alcohol, the drugs, the behavior, etc. What I learned in my own recovery is that if I put alcohol in my body, it's probably going to win. That's not what the step says. The step says I have no control. And I actually derive a great amount of power from that. That makes me feel powerful today, knowing that I can admit that for myself. Recovery is that if I put alcohol in my body. Second step is came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And I actually I'm not insane, is what a lot of people say when they hear the step. Sanity comes from the word sanus, which just means health. So part of the work I do professionally is if you don't like a word like sanity, change the word. Figure out a word that does work for you. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to health. Came to believe that a collective of people who want what's best for me can help restore me to health. So part of the work I do professionally is if you don't. And then step 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood God. And I am very emphatic about God is genderless, genderqueer, however you want to look at it. You can use him, her, they language, just call God, God. And then step 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we. The old timers may be rolling over in their graves hearing me say that, but no, that's something I've learned in my recovery. So came to believe, or made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God, higher power, universe, greater consciousness, health as we understood it. Saying, I can't do this alone, is really what the third step is saying. I need help. And that is very hard for a lot of us to admit. Those first 3 steps continue to save my life. It was, all of them do, but the first 3 especially. It was initially with drugs and alcohol. Over the years, I've had to turn those steps into a prayer with people in my life. Dear God, I am powerless over my family. Those first 3 steps. They are making my life unmanageable. I believe that you can restore me to sanity. I'm going to let you do that.
Over the years, I've had to turn
Those are my
into a prayer with people in my life.
third step prayers in a nutshell. And I pray the third step prayer every morning still, 22 years later.
Making my life unmanageable. I believe that
Whatever you can commit to consistently in your life, if you're on a path of recovery, do it. If it's that morning initial prayer, do it. If it's that morning taking the dog on a walk and just really letting yourself breathe with it, do it. Making your coffee, taking a shower, let that be that time for you, your internal world, your relationship with whoever or whatever you believe exists as higher power, and see what's revealed when you can, as we say, turn that over. So with that, I will turn it over to Father Tom, and I'm looking forward to our talk back, which will happen after the break.
whoever or whatever you believe exists as higher power.
Jamie, thank you. Thank you so much. So we will take a 10-minute break, and if you have questions, you can write them down on the card and give them to me, and then we'll come back at 3 o'clock for a conversation between Jamie and Ariane. So thank you all. Jamie, thank you. Thank you so much. So we will take a 10-minute break, and if you have questions, you can write them down on the card and give them to me, and then we'll come back at 3 o'clock for a conversation between Jamie and Ariane. Thank you all.
center stage.
No, the funny thing is that sunlight was not there before, and now it's like,
Yeah, we can inch up more. I'm moving us up more.
once again, I think all that's just fine. Yep,
That way the sun.
yep, yep.
Anybody would like to share this with anybody else they know, it will remain on our website. So this is live streamed and then also recorded and accessible on the website.
So are you hearing it? Can you hear just a little bit? I might bump it a little bit more up and yeah. Then I'm gonna toughen it trace more.
You're used to hurting people, I imagine.
Okay, yes. I don't know. I've been told it does. I can tell. Trying to figure out. The seat is low.
Do we have to pass the mic back and forth?
I don't think so. I think the mic is loud enough, Jamie. We're going to get started in another minute once people get back with their seats. Do I have to keep leaning?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. No, just talk. Just use my loud voice. I don't think so. I think the mic is loud enough. We're going to get started in another minute once people get back with their seats. Power structures. Trauma caused by systemic power structures. Some light questions.
We can go with the light questions.
Are we ready to get started even though people are standing a little bit? Yeah? Good? All right, we're going to go. Are we good?
Yeah, we're good.
So can I call you Jamie?
Of course.
Okay.
Yep.
And please call me Ariane.
Great.
Okay, thank you. I love the ability to be able to facilitate some conversation and some questions. I have a lot of my own. I've made many, many notes in her book and other books, all in preparation for this. And I'm going to do my best to incorporate these cards that I've been given. But I wanted to start with a little story about my introduction to 12-step recovery.
Please, yeah.
Thanks be to God for me for Al-Anon, which was incredibly helpful in my journey. But I want to share that the first time I walked into an Al-Anon meeting, I was in my late 20s. An older woman I had met at the Episcopal church I had happened into in New York City that I had gone to coffee with a few times, she said, you know, I think you might find something at these Al-Anon meetings we're going to. So I went and listened to somebody share their story of experience, strength, and hope, and cry, and be really, really real. And I walked out and I said, don't you ever take me into a place like that again. I want to go to places where people have their shit together, and I don't want to see somebody fall apart. That's not going to help me with my life and what I need to do. Do you know what that feeling is called? Do you know what that resistance to vulnerability and feeling our feelings is called?
For me, that is just a form of dissociation.
Say more about that, please.
And I talked about dissociation in my talk, and we commonly know it as zoning out, daydreaming. In the cases of people and those of us who have dissociative identities, it could be different fragments of yourself feel split off or divided. But dissociate just means to sever or to divide. That's the word origin of dissociate. And probably the way we are most dissociated as a people is the severing between our head and our heart, our cognitive brain and our feeling body. And for a lot of us, being in cognitive, being in logic, being in the keep shit together mode is how we stay safe. Because for so many of us, we grew up in homes or in structures where feeling feelings was very unsafe. You may have heard things like, I'll give you something to cry about, or big boys don't cry, or be a brave little girl, pick yourself up by the bootstraps. And if you hear messaging like that, whether it's direct or indirect, of course it's going to feel safer to stay in the head. And so that is a form of dissociation that we often don't talk about, and it is a trauma response or a wound response, if the word trauma doesn't fully resonate. And I think for a lot of us, there is such stigma that we have received about mental health, about addiction, that people who can't keep their shit together are crazy. And it would mean something if I admitted that I'm one of those people. So that could also be why we have those types of responses.
I just want to ask you a little bit more
Yeah,
about
yeah.
your family history, especially growing up in what sounds like a really doctrinal, faith-based household.
It's a great word for it, yes.
And, you know, in a way, I would think that type of doctrinal adherence to a system is a way to also dissociate. It's a way of safety and boundary and guardrails, so I can know who's in, who's out, who's okay, who's not okay, who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah. Speaking of doctrine, right? So I had a very Roman Catholic parent and a very evangelical parent. He started Roman Catholic and then became evangelical. And in both churches, the body especially was something to be afraid of. The body will lead you to the near occasion of sin. I heard that in both churches. The body is something that can't be trusted. Your feelings are something that can't be trusted. The only thing that can be trusted is Jesus. So there was at least that version of spiritual solution that was presented. But Jesus was never presented to me as anybody who was friendly. And so that didn't make sense. So of course I stayed in my head and became an overachieving student because it wasn't safe to trust my body or to trust my feelings. And the funny thing is a lot of my feelings still got through because I was that kid who cried a lot. I remember 5 years old, I watched the Sesame Street movie, Follow That Bird. Those of you might remember it from the 80s. In this movie, they painted Big Bird blue when he was kidnapped. And I cried, and I cried, and I cried for hours after watching the movie. And I still remember my parents looking at me like, what is this? Like, we don't know what to do with this level of emotion. So especially if you're the kind of kid who was told, you're too sensitive. It is probably that you had a strong proclivity towards feeling and emotion and even spiritual connection, but that's just not safe in a lot of structures where we grow up, especially, I would argue, certain theological structures.
So yes, I mean, I would say that at the center of the Christian faith is a naked, ashamed, vulnerable, abandoned man on a cross. And one of the prayers we say is, by his wounds, we are healed. And yet I think we're a lot more comfortable healing the wounds of others, pointing out the wounds of others, helping people who are wounded find help, than we are having conversations as faith communities to talk about our own places of woundedness.
It's interesting because I heard that idea so much growing up. You know, by his wounds we are healed, by his wounds we are healed. But it's like, forget about your own.
Right.
Those aren't important as long as you worship the one who came to save you.
Okay, I'm going to speak to a question that
Great.
resonated with me. It was a question about when you know somebody needs help, when you know somebody needs to get to that place of action and you don't want to preach at them, how do you walk alongside somebody at that part of their journey?
That's a hard one. It is admittedly a very hard question because it's not one size fits all. I would say to the person who asked the question, or for anybody who's wondering, if you are a prayerful person, keep praying first and foremost. And something that Janet, who I spent a lot of time talking about, told me is pray that God will give them what they need. I love that prayer because I may think they need a certain thing. But they may need that third DUI that's finally going to cause the switch to flip. So pray that God gives them what they need. Another great AA tool is, especially if it's someone you resent, pray for that person or that thing you resent. And even if you don't mean it, pray anyway. That's something else that 12-step liberated me from was, you know, I got a lot of things from my father in his church. Like, if you don't mean your prayers, God knows it. You're a faker and all
Right.
this. And yeah, the big book is like, do it anyway. Pray anyway, even if you don't mean it. Or pray for the willingness to even start praying. And I think that is something you could do if someone is struggling. So first and foremost, pray. Attraction rather than promotion. But that also gives you still have the right to set your boundaries. Because I think we can struggle with, but I don't want to set them over the edge. I don't want to say anything that's going to make it worse. That's hard. I still deal with that in my life, with loved ones who are addicted. I have married two people who are addicted, even in my own recovery. It's funny I'm being asked the questions. I'm like, God, I wish I knew.
I know.
But another part of what I do is continue to seek support and ask for help. I think keep praying. I go to Janet's original kind of way with me, which is you can validate their struggle, honor their struggle, and you can also challenge, but don't just challenge. Because if you just challenge, if you just beat a person down, if it's just tough love, that's probably going to make it worse. So can you embrace this idea of validating and challenging? Letting people know that the resources are available. They may not take it when you want them to take it, but the seed has at least been planted so that when they are feeling like, hey, I'm ready or I'm prepared, they may be more likely to ask. Obviously, that's general suggestion. Situations have nuance, situation to situation, so if I knew more of the specifics, I might have more to say, but overall, that's my feeling.
Can you say a little bit about accountability in that? Because one of the learnings for me in 12-step is, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change and the courage to change what I can. And to me, that's a prayer of accountability. And it's part of the healing, understanding what's mine to do and what's not mine to do.
I gotta say though, the word accountability brings up some evangelical trauma for me.
Okay, yeah.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
Like, accountability partners and all that. No, but it's a great concept. I tend to think of it more as responsibility. I mean, I think there's some subtle nuance between the two words, but I will say 12-step, together with trauma work, has helped me to take responsibility for things that are my responsibility to take, but to also let go of things that aren't my responsibility. Because especially in my clinical experience, female survivors of trauma who are addicted, we can be great for taking responsibility for everyone else's feelings and for everything that is not ours to take responsibility for. But if someone calls us out rightfully on our stuff, it might be like, well, no, I can get real defensive and abrasive. So through a lot of 12-step ideas, like work on keeping your side of the street clean, focus on what you can control. That's helped me to see where, yeah, maybe I am a partner in my own misery now that I know better. But there was a time in my life where I definitely didn't. And I don't think I'm responsible for what I didn't know before I knew what was going on with me. So.
Part of trauma, I think, is coming to the word forgiveness is a giant loaded word.
We can go there though, if you want.
So even the way you talk about your family,
Yeah.
a Freud quote that has stayed with me for a long time is one of the signs of adult maturity is when you're able to see your parents as the imperfect human beings that they are. And I'm wondering how you worked through getting to, is it a place of forgiveness with your parents? I don't know if that's the right word.
I see it as that. Other people might not. So one of the reasons forgiveness is such a loaded word is I'd venture to guess you can get 10 priests, pastors, clerical figures around a table and get 10 different ideas on what forgiveness is. And people ask me all the time, do I need to forgive in order to move on? I don't think you do. That's my clinical opinion. I do think some level of acceptance is required, and acceptance does not mean you have to like it. I'll be very clear about that. It's a great line in the AA book, acceptance is the answer to all my problems today. It does not mean you have to like it, but it does mean I'm going to stop fighting the fact that it happened. Because at a certain point in my life, I had to realize that I couldn't keep blaming my parents now that I knew kind of what caused the damage. Like, what am I going to do about it? So to me, that is how I practiced acceptance. And I remember being in a 12-step meeting about 8 months sober, and the acceptance passage was being read. And it dawned on me like, a burning bush moment. Like, wow, I just have to accept that my parents are who they are, and they may never change? Wow. Because even up till that point, I was so convinced if only I would get them to understand. If only I got them to ask me for forgiveness. If only I got them to admit, if the people I was dating would just come around and see my point of view. And for so long, my wellness felt contingent on them admitting guilt or blame or something. And it's like, no, they may never change. That was such a moment of peace for me because it made me realize what I can change is myself. What I can change is myself. I think for me, I did come to forgive them after I did a lot of trauma work, after I did a lot of the crying, a lot of the screaming. And even when you forgive someone, folks, I don't believe that means you have to keep letting them beat up on you in your life. Like, I have a very distant relationship with my father these days, but I have to do that to protect myself. I still love him very much. I still have gratitude for a lot of the good things he did give me. So forgiveness is tricky. And if you ever go to a therapist and they say you have to forgive, or if I may step on these toes, if you go to a spiritual director or a pastor, they say you have to forgive, if that's causing you to bristle in some way, honor that. Because this whole forgiveness theology has been used to excuse a lot of bad behavior in churches and society. You just need to forgive them and move on. That's how we'll heal. No, that's putting a Band-Aid on the wound instead of actually addressing it, bringing it to light, and treating it.
We're really good in faith circles about using really big words, but having a hard time getting to the doing action that defines what the big word is.
Amen.
So along those lines, one of the practices you mentioned at the start of this talk, in terms of your expertise, has to do with EMDR and EMDR therapy. So there was a question here, like, can you talk a little bit about more EMDR and how it relates to this work?
Sure. So EMDR, a couple disclaimers. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It is one of the two most researched therapies in the modern era for post-traumatic stress disorder. It is the primary therapy that I received that helped me. I train others in it, I teach it, but even that being said, it is not a panacea. It is not the only therapy out there that can help you to heal and address trauma, especially if you're not with the right fit of therapist. There are many different methods out there that can help clinically with trauma, but where EMDR came into my life is, I don't want to go into a whole big lecture about it, other than to say it was developed by a California psychologist in the 80s, who was a cancer survivor and very interested in mind-body medicine. And she kind of happened upon this discovery that when she allowed her eyes to really move a certain way when she was walking and then meditating, it helped her to clear out some memories that had been disturbing her. And it was eventually developed and researched into a very technical method that I now spend too much of my life training others in. I mean, it's a lot of what defines my career. But the reason I have felt so passionate about training others in it is it was the thing that helped me. I got sober in 2002. In 2004 is when I walked into my EMDR therapist's office, who was also named Janet, another Janet that was a big name in my life. And I was very much in a place where I had quite a bit of talk therapy in my life at that point. I knew the, how does that make you feel, types of questions and what I should be answering. And I knew all the 12-step slogans and how I should be applying 12-step and some Christian ideas to my struggle. But there was still, again, that dissociation between, I think I was pretty spiritually in tune, but it was like head and spirit were still dissociated from body and feelings. And Janet gave me a pamphlet for this EMDR thing, and I'm like, I'm willing to try anything at this point that I haven't tried before. And for me, it was just the thing that really, really, really helped. And we're continuing to develop it and refine it to better serve different populations and to better train therapists in it. But I would say whatever you end up choosing for a trauma method, if you go to a therapist, got a lot of therapists in the room. If you're a therapist, I don't mean to call you out if you don't want to be, but if you're a therapist in the room, raise your hand. A good therapist will walk through your options with you. And for some of us, all we feel we may be able to tolerate coming in is just the talk therapy. That's important. It's still very important, especially if you grew up in a setting where you weren't allowed to talk. But then 2-3 years into my recovery, I talked so much about all the things that happened. I needed to get quiet and into my body and actually feel feelings and body sensations. And so there's other therapies like sensory motor psychotherapy, somatic experiencing, internal family systems, some yoga-based and movement-based therapy approaches that we're really seeing as being very exciting to help people get into that body and those feelings that we may have been so cut off from.
I would love to hear you say a little bit more about somatic. I mean, I do think, again, just going, I mean, we are in a church, I'm wearing this, Tom's wearing this.
Cool.
You know, I said to one of the therapists earlier, somatic in the church is standing, sitting, kneeling. That's these are the body postures that we feel comfortable with.
I grew up with
And
them.
it's a very intellectual endeavor, especially in this tradition of Christianity. It's very much about how smart you are. So when I was introduced to somatics, it was very uncomfortable. You know, I mean, even dancing, which when I was being trained to do as a Brene Brown person, she made us dance, and she said, and I'm making us all do this in the morning with no alcohol present.
Nice.
Because we all dance a lot better when we're at a cocktail party or a wedding, usually because that is there. Because it is a freeing thing, right? It is something where we're exposing something about who we are. So can you just say more about somatics and getting into your body and why this is so hard for us? Because we all dance a lot better when we're at a cocktail
I have my theological ideas, but I'll stay in my lane as a trauma survivor and trauma specialist. I mean, from a trauma perspective, when we are traumatized, and as I've already established, that can take on many, many forms. It could be the freeze tension your body makes when a trusted parent or somebody you love yells at you. It could be that shutdown, that just lethargy that comes over you, that dissociation that comes over you when you're trying to drown out another horrible thing happening in your neighborhood. You know, there's a lot of ways trauma can manifest. Whatever it is, it tends to be uncomfortable in the body. And so we can develop these dissociating techniques very early on so that we don't feel this pain, we don't feel this strain, we don't feel these things. And that's why when drugs and alcohol are introduced, it can help turn off those body feelings. When we learn as a kid, wow, I'm smart, I could be intellectual, then we can ignore a lot of what's in our body. So I think from a trauma perspective, the body can be a very uncomfortable place. The body can feel like a very unsafe place. Then especially if you're sexually abused or sexually assaulted in any way, the body can become a really unhealthy, unsafe, or I would say unhealthy, can feel like a very unsafe place. So if you hear a therapist say, get into the body, it could be like, I don't want anything to do with the body, because my body will backfire on me. My body is something that can't be trusted. And from my spiritual trauma experience, that was a big part of the messaging I got, was your body is going to lead you to sin. So you definitely can't trust it. If you dance a certain way, you may be inviting the near occasion of sin in some boy who's looking at you. And, so a lot of us receive messages about body ugliness. For a lot of us, it's our weight, that if you don't look like the perfect Western white ideal of a woman, then you're somehow flawed. And that's why a lot of us don't trust this thing.
This question, I think, connects with that and has to do with shared trauma. And you brought up, you know, how do we know if we have gone through? But some of our shared trauma is, oh, I don't know, a pandemic, 9/11, my daughter going through school shooting drills since she's been in elementary school through to college. This question is, what are some of the suggestions to deal with trauma that's part of our shared world, and also trauma that's in the systemic systems of injustice in our world that continue to traumatize certain groups? This question is,
It's a great question. It's a big question, so I'm taking a breath to collect myself before I answer. I want to start with systemic trauma and justice, and recognize that I'm in a white body answering this question. And I think if we're white-bodied people, if we're people who are privileged, and I'm somebody who is privileged in most ways, and I don't carry privilege in some other ways, being that I'm queer, I'm large, but I've had to learn to really listen to people, especially people who are not, who have less privilege than I do in certain areas because simply of how they're born versus how I'm born. For instance, during 2020, you talked about the pandemic, and then it was so, I shouldn't say interesting, that's a demeaning word, but then George Floyd was murdered in the months after that, which started a lot of us having discussions. And I want to be very clear, and I've said this publicly, it's not like this just became an issue in 2020, let's be clear, but I think because we were all in this state of collective shock from the pandemic, realizing the imbalances of power,
when that travesty went down, it did encourage a lot of us to look deeper. Encouraged a lot of us to look away, too, which is still happening, and that's, again, another form of dissociation. But speaking to a lot of my colleagues, especially during that year, I had to learn what I could do to make a difference, and part of that is, as a person of privilege, elevating voices of people who don't have as much privilege as I do. Really listening to what is needed in communities that have been affected by systemic oppression versus me thinking I know what's best. So we made some changes, like in our business structure, for instance, which really looks to give our students of color, for instance, more choice to work with other teachers of color if that's what they want. You know, it's not a requirement. It's giving a lot of options. I think deep listening is imperative.
Can you explain what deep listening? So deep, you
Yeah.
use listening a couple times in
Deep,
your
deep
answer.
listening means letting go of my agenda.
Yeah.
Like letting go of my agenda, being willing to be challenged. Because yeah, I'm an educated person with a story. Of course I think I know how things should be. And then when I really make the intention to listen instead of just spout solutions, I think that's when I experience the internal shift. And that deep listening is also what Janet, who I have talked about many times today, did with me when I first came to her needing help. As I mentioned, she spent 3 hours listening to me without trying to solve, fix, or change anything. And I think sometimes, and I'm saying, yes, action and solution is important, but I think too often we don't stop and actually listen before we jump in to trying to fix. So that's a thought that I have. With the pandemic, it was interesting for me because now looking back, it's almost been 4 years, right, that our world changed. Yes, it was collective trauma in that it was happening to all of us. And we all had different experiences of it. Because I really kind of bristled whenever I heard that. We're all in this together. Are we? Really? So I really have tried to hold space for people who I work with clinically. What did it do to you? What did it reveal in you? I'll call myself out. I actually learned and had a lot of positive benefit from the pandemic. Being able to just sit still and get off the road for a year, because I was doing a lot of road warrior teaching at that point, and it's like, wow, I get to actually sit with myself now and rest and commit to my self-care. And I changed a lot in my business structure and my life structure because of it. But I'm not going to be up here saying like, let's all embrace the gifts of the pandemic. If you want to, great. But it was hell for a lot of folks. A lot of folks died. A lot of folks lost people who were close to them. I'm not going to put my experience on everyone else. And I think that's the key thing. In 12-step work, you also hear this line, take what you like and leave the rest.
Yeah.
Even from my talk, it's like if you got something from it, great, but please don't take it as like this is the definitive authority on what you need to do to get clean and sober. Laura knows my feelings on this, that counselors can be great about follow my program and in 10 easy steps, you'll be cured. And a lot of us as human beings want that. We want someone to tell us exactly what to do. What prayers do I have to pray? What formula do I have to drink? I can't tell you the answers. I can give you, as I mentioned, some experience, strength, and hope. And then it's up to you to take what works for you, trial and error it, as long as you're taking action, I think is the key. A part of action might start with listening. Great question.
So you just talked about we all want the 10 or less easy steps to get to perfection and healing. And when you talked earlier about when am I going to get over it and why do I have to keep going back to these same stories? And I do find that interesting because in my faith tradition, as in most Christian ones, we listen to the same stories again and again.
The word of the Lord.
And again,
yes.
Thanks be to God. And yet we don't see there's something weird about that fact, right? That we keep listening to these old stories. What is it about revisiting the stories and owning the other people in the stories. There's two questions here that have to do with loyalty to family, how that we want to be separate and boundaried, and yet we also want to be present and in relationship. How do we navigate those kinds of relationships in our own healing? And their healing too, wanting them to be whole.
I think a philosophy that I've really learned to embrace in all levels of my recovery is this idea of dialectics, or both and. Therapists, the whole idea of dialectic behavior therapy, that's part of it, but dialectics is bigger than that. It's this idea that two things can be true at the same time. You can love your family very much. I love my family very much, and I also know it's not good for me to spend a lot of time with them. And everybody has their opinion on what it means if you don't spend time with your family. But it's just that, someone else's opinion. It's the church's opinion. It might be your family's opinion. Oh, she's a horrible daughter because she doesn't come around anymore. They're entitled to their opinion. So I think when we talk about family loyalty, I don't want to judge anybody because I know family roots run deep. I know that it can feel hard to set boundaries with people you love, but my hope would be you could also learn to look at, is this a trauma bond? Is this a maladaptive attachment? Is this love, or is this my trauma response, feeling I always have to keep going back into the same family situation? And this is a lot of what those of us who are adults still navigating dysfunction have to face. And I know, trust me, I know it can be hell when you're doing that with your own children. If that's the family bond, if you have a child who's struggling or suffering. I've never birthed a child, but I helped to raise 2 stepchildren. And yeah, it can feel miserable setting boundaries in those situations, yet at a certain point, we have to. So I don't know if there's any more specific about family loyalty, but I will say in general, the both and becomes very important. You can love, you can honor, I think even, but you also need to take care of yourself. Because I don't think you need, I'm trying to think of the most careful way to say this, which is usually the sign inside, just say it. You don't need to make yourself a martyr just to take care of your family. You don't need to destroy yourself just to take care of your family. I don't think that's a very loving thing for anybody involved.
One of the phrases that occurred to me that I heard recently, and those like catch trauma catchphrases.
Yeah.
There was a resonance and truth in that and in what you were just saying, and it was, if it's hysterical, it's historical.
Oh, yeah.
Right? If we're having a response that's a lot, and you shared the story of when you had that response with that parish priest.
The tantrum.
Right, and I thought it was so interesting that he said she's acting like a little girl. I mean, that must have been her key, that you were re-experiencing something. So one of the questions here is, how do I know if something traumatic is still affecting me? What are the signs in my life that enable me to see, wait, there's something historical here that maybe I need to be paying attention to?
What's coming up in my gut is that if it still burns in your body in some way, and this is why learning to listen to the body can be very important. When the stomach rattles, when the heart tenses, when you have that crying jag or tantrum, whatever you want to call it. And this is not meant to pathologize tears in any way, because I think it's very human. But I recently told a friend the other day, when I cry like this, like that kind of hysterical, I don't like that word particularly, but I know what you mean. But when I cry at that level, it usually is that something very young is getting tripped up. And even that could be a gift. It could announce this needs to be looked at. On one hand, my more clinical answer would say whatever feels like an out of proportion response. Like the priest even said, she's acting like a little girl. This is a tantrum. For him, that was clearly out of proportion. And I would say in my work life today, as someone who runs a business, if I saw someone who acted that way on the job site, yeah, that might feel out of proportion, but I also hopefully now know to look that there's something deeper going on with them.
I was watching your TED Talk earlier, and you were talking about how, we celebrate the athlete and the people who are traumatized and they still win. Like they work through their trauma, they work through their pain in a moment to achieve this glory and success. And we don't celebrate time and process and journey. And in some ways, I think the 12-step approach methodology framework is a helpful way to walk through a very toxic world. We're powerless against so many things all the time. How do you navigate that reality of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, American individualism, capitalistic, all of that stuff, which is really not interested in taking time for people's feelings?
Yeah. Well, the whole pull yourself up by the bootstraps thing, a common response to that is just go easy. Some people may not have boots, let alone bootstraps, let alone have ever been shown how to pull themselves up. And that's why I'm very fortunate, blessed, that the right teachers showed themselves in my life to teach me how to do those things. It's hard to do what you need to do to heal in a culture that is so hell-bent on productivity, on not showing your feelings, on showing up and performing. And I know I could even come across with a bit of a harsh edge when I say things like, you gotta take action. It's not just that this happened to you, it's what are you gonna do about it? But part of what you're gonna do about it might be giving yourself that time and your space to heal, as long as you can. Or like if you still have to go to work because that's what you have to do to take care of your family, can you give yourself that time in the evening? Even if it's just like, if any of you watch Succession, the HBO show. I personally love that she scheduled time to cry in the last season. I mean, again, that seems like such an American thing to do, right? We have to schedule time for grief. But if that's what you gotta do, that's what you gotta do, because just working through it is not necessarily going to be productive for anyone in the long run. I mean, what some 12-steppers might say to that is, whatever you put ahead of your sobriety or your recovery, you're probably gonna lose anyway if you don't take that time to give yourself what you need. So I have to remind myself of that when I can feel impacted by the grind sometimes.
Tom, I can't tell what time it is, but I'm sensing we're getting to a closing time. Yeah? So. Okay, great. Good sense by me. So I want to close with something from your book.
Sure.
From this book, Trauma in the 12 Steps. This is at the end, the conclusion. We're all just walking each other home.
Oh, yeah.
And you're talking about Ram Dass and when he forcibly left Harvard and went to India to find and study with his guru, Neem Karoli Baba. Am I saying that right? And so he introduced his guru, Neem Karoli Baba, to LSD, and that had absolutely no effect on this meditative teacher and guru. And he said that kind of quote-unquote medicine was good for beginners, but it would not keep you in the state of consciousness you desire. He taught that only love can do that. The kind of love that does not judge, scorn, or require that you be a certain way. Love that embraces, love that accepts. Love that is so powerful, it can dispel any fear that trauma creates. Love that knocks down walls and builds bridges in their wake. I want to invite, obviously you still probably sometimes feel judgment and you feel scorn, right? How do you hold fast to remembering what that love is for yourself and in your work?
This is my tendency to deflect. Ram Dass, or Richard Alpert, who she mentioned in that quote, he also said, if you think you're enlightened, spend a week with your family. That's another favorite Ram Dass teaching of mine. But how do I hang on to that love? I mean, to me, this is the gift of telling stories. Because every time I'm at a podium or giving a talk and I talk about Janet Leff, the person who gave me this so unconditionally, it's like it's God's way of sending me a fax or an email saying, remember, I got you. I had you in that moment. whenever I think about the way my brother at 15 years old really supported my need to do whatever I had to do to help with my addiction because he saw how much I was struggling. And just how ahead of his years he was and how expansive his love was even at that age to tell me, Jamie, I love you, I'm here for you. I've had a lot of bad stuff happen, but now, 20-some years later, I have more memories of the good stuff. And so when I do get criticized, I remember those moments, or even telling my story again today is going to fuel me for a while, until the next time somebody asks me to share a little bit of a part of my story. So I think that's how I stay anchored. I also feel that one of the reasons I still keep a foot and an identity in Christianity, even though it hurt me so much, is that Christianity is the faith that believes that God became human. I see God in all of you. You know, I see God in people, which is why it burns me up when I hear some very dogmatic, doctrinal people say, like, you can't care more about people than you care about God.
That's stupid.
And I'm like, you are missing the point of the incarnation. So even on days when I can't stand people, you're allowed to have those. P.S., you know? It's like, what might this be teaching me? How can I still see God in that person? Because I'm grateful that so many people did that with me. Like the priest who guided me through my temper tantrum, he walked me home because he ended up being a mentor in my life, like Janet. So we're all just walking each other home.
When I first met you, I shared that quote, God became human so that we might become divine. And I want to thank you for the ways in which your humanity has helped me in my quest towards divinity and all of us here today. I think so. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you, Ariane. I would have loved the conversation to go on much longer. And it can go on for a while longer. You're welcome to stick around.
Yeah, my table in the back.
Jamie will be at the table, and Ariane, you're going to stick around for a little while.
Yeah.
Thank you to all of you who joined us online. You can now switch the channel for the Ravens.
Yep.
But before you go, our parishioner Warren Sarand is here with a quick advertisement about our next event.
Yes, thank you. I came here about a year and a half ago from New York, and I've been looking for a way to contribute to the church community. And I work in books, so I'm really excited to come to this event today. And I'm going to organize a book talk here on March 16th with an author I saw at the Church of Good Shepherd in Ruxton, and that is Gary Brewster, whose father is the subject of a really incredible new biography called Self-Destruction. I won't give away too much about the plot. It's about a life of public service, serving in World War II, coming back, being a public servant, helping and really